Good day, everyone. This is John Scarborough. As you can see, we got the brush hog up here pulled up in the shop. Got it all pressure washed off and cleaned up. I wanted to talk a little bit today about what we're going to do on this brush hog. We're going to do some repairs on it. We've done several things. We were able to get the pretty decent price for the brush hog. Well, very, very decent price for the brush hog, simply because it needed a lot of work and a lot of repairs. And I still don't know for sure if the brush hog will last forever. I mean, it's well, nothing's going to last forever, but you know what I'm saying. Anyway, I think we've already gotten our money's worth out of it for sure, so we're going to keep trying to buy some time with it. But there's a lot of places that were repaired on this thing quite a while back ago, and then there's more places that need new repairs. Like you can see here, these welds right here. I don't know if you can see it or not. There's actually a split right there on the back side of that weld. A lot of times what that comes from is from the weld itself being put on way too hot, and that makes the base metal brittle, okay? And so you can tell that it was put on too hot by all of this. You see all of that? That's gouging right there. That right there comes from it just being too hot. Especially when you're doing a flat weld, you should be able to weld that without seeing any of that, okay? So that just comes from being way, way too hot. That was not done, that was done, I think it was factory. But anyway, so it lasted for a while, but that's what comes from that. It's just, you know, it's just way too hot welds, okay? But I wanted to talk about the repair job here. And this was done by a farmer, and so I hate knocking on farmers and farmer welds, but a lot of times farmers welds, well, they just don't look the best. And that would be fine if they held together. Problem is, many times they don't hold together. You see that one right there? That is completely split away, the entire weld up, the full length of that weld. And the bad thing is it's when you look down close, you can tell it wasn't even ever attached. So he welded it on there, probably thought it was attached, and then it turned out it wasn't. You can see here, I don't know if you can tell or not, but I mean, we're split all the way off of there. And so there's probably several reasons for that. One is, a lot of times people, I find that farmers will get in a hurry, and I've been guilty of it myself, get in a hurry and they'll do it, and they'll try to do it without cleaning it up. Now I will say, there's a lot of places in welding when it comes to farm welding that it literally, you have to do a cost-benefit analysis and a time analysis. And many times, you literally don't have the time to clean it up, and you're better off to just go ahead and weld it up, depending on what it is, rather than pulling out a buffer and getting it perfectly clean, okay? But you have to understand what it is you're welding when you do that, okay? So there are places that you can do that, and they make a 6011 welding rod, and that is for some really dirty welding. It can weld through some really dirty stuff. The problem is it's still not a professional rod. Despite what everyone says, I hear a lot of people say that it's a very penetrating rod, and I have not found that to be the case at all, okay? But not only that, it isn't a very flexible rod, okay? If you are going to do welding like this spot right here, this is, nobody repaired this. This is a factory weld, and it busted loose right there. And you can tell the cracking across there. For me to repair that, if I was going to try to do a quick job, which I'm not on this, because this thing it's a brush hog. It gets a real whooping. There's a lot of vibration, and anytime you have vibration, you want either MIG, or you can use flux core. I would suggest MIG, or you can use 7018. Okay, if I was going to do a quick job of it, then I would use a 6010 welding rod. Okay, the best way, and I'm talking about if I wasn't going to clean it, if I wasn't going to take my time to clean it, I would use a 6010 rather than a 6011. And the biggest problem that I find with the 6011s is when you weld it up, the slag looks really good. And then you don't clean it off because you didn't have the time to clean it the first time. Why would you have time to clean it the second time? Okay, so you never get a good look at the weld. Well, then when you do clean it off, you get the same type of welds that I was talking about over there, which a lot of those welds were done with a MIG gun, but not all of them. But the point is, you get that type of welding, okay? And incidentally, if you do weld with a MIG gun, you definitely want to clean it. That's more important than 6010, 6011. or anything like that. It's even more important than 7018, even though you should have a good clean surface when you're welding with 7018. Okay, so what I'm trying to say is use a 6010 whenever possible. Now, I'm not against a 6011, okay? I use a 6011 in certain places. If it's a really nasty, dirty spot and it's thin metal, and I'm in a bad position, I'll use 6011 because I know it's so thin that any heat at all will cause it to bond together and have approximately the same amount of strength. And also when I'm doing it, it's usually in a scenario when strength is not a factor. It's just like sealing off a hole or something like that, okay? And I will do that on occasion. If strength is a factor and I can't, let's say I can't get a buffing wheel in there or I don't have time to get a buffing wheel in there, then I will actually go over it occasionally with a 6011 and then come as a cleaner rod to actually clean it off, knock the slag off, and then go back over it with like a 7018 or an 8010 or something like that, okay? So when you're welding something like this, okay, it's okay to do some farm welds and get something done. Like this one, for instance. I'm gonna show you this right here. This right here looks to me, if I can get down close, it looks to me it was actually welded with 7018. It's not a good looking weld. There's a lot of inclusions and holes and places it didn't tie in. And so it's not a good looking weld. But because of the fact that it was 7018, the places that did tie in held this together and it didn't break apart. Okay, so that's how good 7018 is even an imperfect weld can still be better. I've seen 6010 welds on places with high vibration split completely off because and they were a roll of nickels. I'm talking they were perfect, okay? And it was simply because it's not designed to handle the flexibility that a 7018 is, okay? So what I'll do here is I'm going to go over a lot of these places. If it's not broken, I'm not going to re-go over it because this thing has gotten a serious whooping, okay? So like this right here, this has gotten a serious whooping. So there's no reason for me to re-weld that. It's already proven itself. It's ugly. It's not, it's not an impressive looking weld, but it's not bad. But you can see here this cracking is starting down in here. I don't know if you can see it or not. Try to get close. Try to see that. Okay, so the cracking is starting down inside of there, and it's coming up, and it's stopping right in there, okay? So what I'll do is I will actually weld up this whole crack, and then I'll do a pretty decent weld here, and then phase it back into there. I'm not going to re-weld the whole thing, but I'm going to phase that back just to spread out the pressure. You don't want to just abruptly stop right there, or you will actually cause a weakness right in that spot. Okay, so I'm gonna go over that. I'm gonna do some 6010. I'll do mostly 8010 because it's got a nice strength to it. But because this is going to get so much vibration, if I do 8010, I'm going to make sure I do a double pass because anytime you don't use a flexible welding source like either MIG or either MIG or 7018, and flux core, if you're not doing something that can handle flexibility, then you want to be sure to do more than one pass because the slower that weld cools down, the more flexible the nature of it actually becomes. Okay, so you're not going to get as good as 7018 by using 8010. Okay, but if you do a pass of 6010 and then another pass of 8010, you can actually increase the flexibility more than it would have been. Okay, and that's a lot of times that's why on pipelines and pressure pipe and things like that, they're using 8010, 6010 and 8010. Okay, but they do it with more than one passes. Even though a lot of times we could fill that pipe all the way up. We could literally, there are some scenarios where we could actually we could put in a bead and then go all the way out to cap, all in one pass. Okay, but they won't let you do it. They require that you, on a lot of jobs, they require that you put in bead, hot pass, filler pass, and then a cap. And the reason for that is because the science is there that says that by putting more than one pass on there, you're actually increasing that flexibility. So that's kind of what that's all about. It's still not as good as a 7018. That's why 7018 still exists, even though it's a very slow welding rod. It just is one of the best in flexibility I've ever seen. They say that MIG's as good, but personally, my own personal anecdotal experience is 7018 ends up being better. Maybe it's just my own experience, but that's what it seems like. Anyway, whatever the case may be, we're going to get in here, we're going to start doing some welding and get some repairs. We'll probably come right back and show y'all a couple places what we did. We will end up having to put some patch plates like on places like this, and we'll try to show y'all what we ended up doing and how we repaired that. Just keep that in mind, guys. I just wanted to make sure I said that to a lot of people is, you know, think about what the thing is that you're going to be welding. If it's not going to have a huge amount of vibration, you can probably get away with some stuff. You know, like if it's an old fence post that's never hardly ever going to get pushed on or something. I've seen people put 6011 welds on there and them hold for 20 years. Okay, but don't try to get away with it with something like this. If you're going to spend the time, the money, the effort to redo all of this, get you a good welding rod, spend some time, get it cleaned up, and do it right. All right, guys, I'll be back and show y'all some of the results. All right, guys, so I figured this would be a good point to carry on and show y'all a little bit about what we've done and what else we need to do. So over here you can see in this spot where we had that split open weld, we actually got that all welded up. Now I wanted to do this in realistic terms. So if I was doing this for a customer, what I would have done is I would have actually taken some time and to, you know, prettied these welds up, okay? But since I'm doing it for me, typically I don't make my welds as pretty when I'm doing them for myself, especially when I'm doing them on a scenario like this. I mean, this brush hog, it's 8 out in a lot of places. Like you look at that right there, you know, like it's not going to last forever. Well, I can make it last a good amount of time with proper care, but I'm not going to make it last forever. So typically I'm not going to sit here and put a whole bunch of time into an absolute fabulous weld, okay? So that's kind of what I wanted to do. I mean, for YouTube, I thought about actually trying to put on a better looking weld and doing better stuff, but I was like, you know what? I need to show realistic, real world things of like what I would actually do in here. This is a perfectly acceptable weld. It's not gorgeous, but it's what you call a Gorilla weld, okay? It's perfectly acceptable. There's nothing wrong with it. It's tied in all the way around, you know, but it's, you know, it's strong, but it's not pretty, okay? It's not bad. You know, I'm not saying it's bad. It's just not the best weld that I could do if I really, you know, took some time and tried to make it perfect, okay? But also, this is way bigger than what you need. So the reason for making this so big was because the weld, this metal that they put on here, had rusted out from the bottom, and it was really, really thin. So I actually had to bridge across there just in order to get a good tie-in. So that, typically, that is not how, I mean, that's just too much weld for that area. And then this is another scenario right here. So this is where your hydraulic pump actually, your hydraulic ram actually hooks right here, you know. So that's where all the pressure is right in here. So when they laid this plate down, they actually left a big void. They didn't have it setting down flat, and that's a mistake. When you leave air in there, not only are you giving yourself a place for metal to fall in, it's also not as strong. Like metal is stronger when it's, you know, it's going to be stronger if you're connecting them solid together. But then thirdly, though, the mistake they made is they didn't clean up the rust. And I've seen a lot of people do that when they're laying one sheet of plate on top of another to try to do a patch job like this. And they will lay it right over top of the paint, the rust, whatever is there, and then they'll weld it up. And they think they're fixing the problem. In reality, they're actually making it worse, because oxygen is still going to get in there, and it's going to continue to rust, but it's actually going to rust both layers now. So now you're going to have 2 layers of rusted metal, and in some cases worse, because if any water gets in there through massive pinholes that are left all in there, then it can't hardly escape and dry out. So in this scenario, I actually put a piece of rebar in there. I did not use sucker rod, and I wouldn't suggest using sucker rod in this scenario, and I will tell you why in just a minute. But I used a piece of 1/2-inch rebar there. It's not my favorite method. It's not a beautiful method by any means, but it is stout. It's strong enough. So what I actually did was, you know, so the spacing between there was like the weld had completely lifted up and cracked away from there, and the spacing between there was over, I mean, it was about a 1/2 inch. I mean, it was a big old gap. I mean, you can see the other side that's still there. It's just a big old hole. Now, I've heard the term, oh, well, a good welder can weld that up. And I'll tell you that a good welder can weld that up, but I'll tell you that a better welder knows better, okay? And the reason is by the time you get done filling that up, you create so much heat around here that you actually denature your metal, and you will cause it, you actually get it to be too hot, and you will cause it to fracture right beyond that weld. So once you've done all that welding and you've filled all of that up and you're just so impressed with yourself, after a while you'll end up, like if I were to fill up that hole right there. Now, just filling up the hole, I've done that before to make places look better, you know, but if I were to do that in a point where it needed a lot of structure, like let's say I filled a gap up of that size all the way across here. Well, this is a point that needs, you know, it's a pressure point, okay? If I filled that up, I would create so much heat right here that I would actually cause that weld to fracture on the other side of it, because I would start to denature the metal right there. So that can be a mistake if it's not necessary. I'm not saying that it's not necessary in places, but I'm just saying that it's not necessary. A lot of times it can be a mistake. So back to this, I wanted to make sure that was good and stout, and I didn't want to try to fill all of that up. So instead, I went ahead and put the sucker rod in there, not sucker rod, I'm sorry, rebar, and then welded it up with a root pass of 6010 and then 7018. And that's just because this is where all your strength is. That's where all the problem, you know, that's where all of your stress is going to be, is right in here, okay? And then it spreads out from there, okay? I couldn't see underneath here. I could see on this side the welds are good, but I couldn't see underneath there, so I didn't know how bad they were, so I just went ahead and beefed all of that up just to be sure that we were good. Okay, that's the reason I went into the extra effort in that area. Now back to the rebar, why I wouldn't use sucker rod in this area. I would be fine with using sucker rod in certain places, but the thing about sucker rod is, first off, when they make sucker rod, they actually make the entire rod a certain amount hard. Okay, it's a slightly higher carbon steel. Now it's not like high carbon tool steel or anything like that, but it's not mild steel either. It's somewhere in between, and I forget the numbers on it, but it's not an exact mild steel that this would be right here. This rebar would be. Okay. The second thing is a lot of times that steel is actually it's actually magnetized, and if it's not magnetized, it has been magnetized before. And so there's just a lot of things that denature that metal and makes it to where it's not the best metal for high strength areas. Okay, so that's where I would go ahead and use a sucker rod. It's a more mild steel. It hasn't been through a lot. It hadn't been down in the ground getting magnetized, and it's not hardened. So that's something I would do there. And the same thing I'll do here. This spot is not going to be as important, but you can tell there's just no way that, like, if I fill that weld up, I'm going to have the same thing. I'm just putting too much heat on there. It's not that I can't, it's that I know better than to try to fill that up. Okay, so we're actually going to put that in there and create strength on both sides of that. If you're on a professional job, you'll actually get run off for doing that. But if I'm being realistic, none of this would be on a professional job. So anyway, so what we're going to do right here, you can tell this is a high pressure point. I mean, it comes out over here, and this is what's really holding on all of your wheels and everything. All of this it goes under a lot of load, and that load carries all the way back to that joint, and you can tell that's what's really getting butchered right here. Okay, so what we're actually going to do here, I've got some old scrap steel I had bought from the scrapyard a while back ago. I knew it would come in handy somewhere. We're actually going to lay it there, and we will tack weld a decent tack right in here, maybe right in here. But I'm not going to come up this way at all, and I'm not going to weld here at all yet. Okay, we're just going to do about a 1/2 inch tack, maybe 7018 even. That wouldn't hurt at all. Put a light tack with some 6010, and then go over about a 1/2 inch with some 7018. Would not hurt a bit. Okay, get that tacked on pretty good, and then I'm actually going to heat this up, and I'm going to bend that down to create a nice tight spot. But I'm not going to make the mistake that the previous owner did, and that is I'm going to make sure that all of this is clean, okay? Now, it's not going to be perfect because I've still got a big hump here, and it's just not going to be perfect, okay? We know we're not going to create a perfect situation here regardless. There's just no way to do it. It's an old brush hog that's been beat up, okay? But we're going to do the best we can. We're going to get our buffer, and we're going to knock off a pretty good bit of that, and then we're going to try to decrease that void as best as possible, mostly just for strength, and then we'll weld all that up. This right here, I mean, it's all getting covered up. There's no reason to make that any prettier than that, okay? Like I said, if it was for a customer, I would. But this is thin metal. Not only was it fairly thin when they put it on here, but it was actually, this is been rusted out from the bottom, okay? So it is actually really thin. So this is actually very acceptable. Clean it off so that you can make sure that you actually connected it. But it's acceptable because all I did was lay it here and go as fast as I could all the way across there. Because if I would have slowed down any, I would have had big holes in there. Okay, so this is not the place to try to make that pretty. If you do want to make that pretty, you can go over as fast as you can, and then you can come back with some 60-10 and then try to make it pretty. No reason for that in this scenario. Okay, this right here, I put 70-18 on here. It was actually split and cracked along there. You want to be careful with your box here. You don't want to create so much heat that you melt your seals or anything like that, okay? Especially since I'm putting all this heat around here. So what I did was I'd actually weld a little bit here, and then I would move somewhere else. And then I welded one pass, and then I moved away. And then I welded another pass, and then I moved away, okay? Notice that I did not spend a lot of time and try to create a perfect weld. I could have gotten in a really comfortable position, and I could have really made a beautiful 70-18 weld there, okay? You get down to a point where you've got to do a cost-benefit analysis, okay? That is an acceptable farm weld, all right? These welds right here, these are not acceptable farm welds, okay? Those are not acceptable farm welds. That's where you run into your problems. These welds right here, those are not acceptable farm welds, okay? These right here, these are acceptable farm welds, all right? They're fine. They're not beautiful. They're nothing special, but they're not bad. The main thing is they are tied in, okay? Now, I don't necessarily clean off all of my welds when I'm doing farm welds, but I would suggest if you are not 100% confident that you tie it in on your weld, I suggest clean it off, okay? And if you're still learning, I would suggest cleaning it off more often in order to inspect your work and make sure that you did tie in.